Hi everyone. I just wanted to let everyone know that this video is copyrighted. It cannot be recorded or sold. Thank you. Hello everyone. My name is Taylor Coates and I'm going to talk about the history and impact of institutional, structural, and systemic racism that is occurring in America. So the first thing we should address is what exactly is racism and how did it form from race? So according to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, race is an invented term that has been used to describe and categorize people into various groups based on characteristics such as physical features, genetic heredity, and particular an individual's skin. Race is a social construct that denies and gives privileges to individuals. To understand the concept of racism and all that goes into it, we must explore the history of how race and white privilege and anti-color came to be. Did you know that the Europeans didn't start referring to themselves as white people until English society first encountered and contrasted themselves against East Indians in the 1613s during their colonial pursuits? They developed social inventions such as white, savage, and subhuman to categorize people based on their skin color. Due to these social inventions, white colonists were able to dispose and marginalize Native American people and enslave most African descended people for generations. What about the fact that slavery was not for life or hereditary for African slaves until the 1700s to 1800s in America? This meant that the child of a slave did not necessarily have to become a slave themselves. In fact, before this time period, many cultures allowed slaves to earn wages, gather with others, marry, and potentially buy their freedom. Now let's discuss about the concept of racism and the different levels of racism. Racism is defined as a system of advantages based on race that involves systems and institutions. These systems and institutions include, but are not limited to, medical institutions, the judicial system, and the government institutions. Racism operates at different levels, including individual racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism. The ones we are focusing on for this video are institutional and structural and systemic racism. So let's discuss about white privilege and Jim Crow laws, which really led to the foundation of a lot of the racisms that we talked about earlier. The white society in the South were notably reluctant to shift their views of African Americans after the abolishment of slavery and sought ways to continue to exploit the labor of the African descent people while concurrently remaining privileged. This can be seen as the first modern form of white privilege. This system of segregation would later lead to new racist laws called Jim Crow laws, which allowed the legitimization of anti-black racism to spread across America. The laws placed further reinforcements through social customs that kept whites and African Americans separated in places such as restrooms, water fountains, waiting rooms, hospitals, prisons, churches, cemeteries, movie theaters, public transportation, and more. This segregation of race resulted in the creation of a multitude of new racist laws and practices whose ramifications can still be seen impacting our country today. Institutional racism occurs in organizations or institutions, like its name suggests. An example of institutional racism occurring in the medical field is the Tuskegee Syphilis Project. So in 1932, a syphilis study was conducted on 600 black men without the patient's informed consent. 399 of the men had syphilis. However, the researchers told the men that they were being treated for bad blood and that they would receive free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance, which was expensive for black families at the time if they participated in their study for bad blood. Even when penicillin became available to treat the disease, the men of the study were not offered it. Even if they went to the army, who was giving out penicillin to help prevent the spread of syphilis to their men during the world wars, they were not offered it. This meant that the men who had syphilis were passing the disease to their wives and future children. The study continued for 40 years until a whistleblower exposed it to the Associated Press. The U.S. Public Health Service later had to provide all necessary medical care for the survivors of the study, and later on medical benefits to the victim's family after the victim's family has sued. President Bill Clinton issued a formal presidential apology for the study and to the Black community for the injustice done to them from it. The history of the project has led to many African Americans distrusting the medical field, and many often do not seek help from the hospitals due to this mistrust. In fact, this is a major reason that a lot of older generations do not feel that it's safe to take the COVID-19 vaccine as well. So let's talk about systemic racism and redlining. Systemic racism is an infrastructure of ruling promoted by government or authoritative entities where one ethnic group in a society is given certain rights and privileges while denying other ethnic groups those same rights and privileges. Redlining is a practice of systemic racism which consisted of denying or limiting financial services to specific neighborhoods, particularly those that reside in mostly colored or poor neighborhoods. White, colored, and rich neighborhoods receive green line, while colored and poor neighborhoods receive red line, denoting their undesirability. Banks and insurance companies were able to deny services based on those living within red line areas. This led to people in these neighborhoods having limited access to banking, healthcare, retail, and even grocery stores. A notable exception to redlining that is continuing today is proliferation of liquor stores and bars within these neighborhoods. So I just want to point out that Detroit is technically a red line neighborhood. In case you didn't know, it's because more than 75% of the people living in Detroit are African American. And we considered that to be one of the biggest reasons as to why Detroit, or outside of downtown Detroit more specifically, why we see so much blight compared to suburb neighborhoods or downtown Detroit. So a prominent Black neighborhood that was affected by the practice of redlining is West Adams Heights, or also known as Sugar Hill, Los Angeles. Black homeowners of Sugar Hill were sued by their white neighbors due to breaking racially restrictive covenants, which were agreements that were embedded in property deeds that made homeowners promise to never sell to African Americans or other minority groups. The Black homeowners fought this suit and won in court. However, a few years after the historical court case, the California Highway Commission approved the building of the Santa Monica Freeway that would require the homes of many Black families that resided in Sugar Hill to be paved over. The residents who lost their homes were not entitled to assistance from the government in finding and moving to new homes and were provided just compensation for the loss of their homes. This meant that the government paid for demolishing their houses, but they're not going to give you any help in finding new homes. You have to move out by a specific date, and you have to be out of there at that time, or else you will be arrested. Now let's talk about the modern day racist disparities facing the United States today. First, there's the employment disparity. African Americans and those of Hispanic heritage have continued to face systematically higher rates of unemployment, fewer job opportunities, lower pay, poorer benefits, and greater job instability. These constant differences reflect systematic barriers to quality jobs through outright discrimination against people of color or through occupational segregation where non-white employees end up in lower paying jobs than whites. Second, let's talk about the housing disparity. After 5 decades, the federal housing discrimination ban has failed to end segregation and provide equal access to housing opportunities for all, particularly to those of African American, Latino, or Native American descent. The plight of homelessness continues to be a major social problem for minorities who are more vulnerable to evictions. Third, there is an incarceration disparity between minorities. African American adults are 5 times more likely to be in prison than white Americans and twice as likely to have a family member in prison at some point during their childhood. Mass incarceration of African Americans has led to long-term health issues including mental health disorders, diabetes, asthma, hypertension, HIV, and hepatitis C. Incarcerated individuals also face increased risk of sexual violence and infectious illness, loss of family connections, as well as trauma resulting from prison policies, which has resulted in heightened risk for PTSD, depression, and anxiety. The families of the incarcerated individuals are also at risk from trauma of having a family member imprisoned at this time. Fourth is the war on drugs. The war on drugs serves as a powerful mechanism of mass incarceration and oppression for people of color. The aggressive criminalization of certain drugs targeted heavily against certain communities is a method of oppressing, disrupting, and disempowering marginalized communities. The War on Drugs initiative was one of the many reasons that the Black community continues to not trust the police or judicial system. Fifth is the immigration policies. The U.S. practices a form of structural racism when it comes to dealing with immigration policies. This is when a system of public policies, institutional practice, cultural representation, and other norms that work in reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequality. The undocumented population of today, mostly Latino and overwhelmingly people of color, must worry about the threat of apprehension or deportation. The families live every day under the threat of separation via deportation and are largely denied public benefits to maintain a healthy living, thus extending the negative implication of structural racism in the current immigration system. Six is the wealth gap between races. Non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic families in the U.S. have a large and persistent wealth gap when compared to non-Hispanic white families. The Federal Reserve Board has found that a typical median family wealth for a white family is about $184,000. A typical Black family owned $23,000, and a typical Hispanic family owned $38,000. The wealth gap between races is historically rooted through government-sponsored discriminatory policies, which along with the systemic barriers today continues to hamper Black and Hispanic families' wealth accumulation. Lastly, and probably the most important, is the voter suppression currently occurring for minorities. Through the U.S., though the U.S. has made significant progress since Jim Crow era, people of color continue to lack full voting rights, whether through felony disenfranchisement, which means if a person is in jail or has been to jail, they do not have the right to vote, which heavily targets Black citizens, or through denial of having the right to vote based on living in the U.S. territories such as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, or Guam, and even those that reside in Washington, D.C. American democracy requires the participation of all its citizens, no matter their race, religion, or criminal background. Every adult citizen has the right to vote, and that right should not be taken away by the federal lawmakers that are supposed to protect American democracy. So what can we do to help prevent systemic racism? Well, first, become educated about what systemic racism is and how it can occur. How can you stop it in your work, your school, or your organization that you're at? The next thing to do is exercise your right to vote. If you have the right to vote, please vote. You're the only one who can bring in people who can work with the policies that you want to change. Next, we have to be able to willing to celebrate the different cultures and races. You cannot be stuck in your own race. You can't be stuck in your own culture. Go explore. Don't just stay in your own little clique. You have to step out of your comfort zone. Contact your government officials. They're the ones who have access to changing policies. They're the ones who you can report to if you notice systemic racism, it's institutional racism or structural racism occurring in your job or workplace, or in your school, or in your community as a whole. Next, have conversations. Don't be afraid to talk about it. You don't have to be scared to talk about systemic racism. It isn't a taboo topic. It is becoming known. We do not have to fear being silent anymore. So these are just a few channels if you want to learn a little bit more about the history of Black America and Always visit the National African American History and Cultural Museum, or go to your local museum and learn about as much as you can of Black or Asian or Hispanic culture. Like I said, don't be afraid to learn, because without knowledge, we're doomed to repeat. And that is one thing we do not want to do.